All awake? All right. I have a public service announcement to start off with. I am to remind students that the Student Choice Award is yours to vote on. The ballots are at reception and it closes at 2, so don't forget to vote. All right. I'm Jensen. I am a newly West Coast of Canada moved professor to the University of British Columbia. I'm a researcher first and foremost. I have had the privilege of researching gender video games technologies for the last almost 25 years now. I come from a little island off the coast of Vancouver, Galiano Island, top right. It is only 18 miles long and 3 miles across at its biggest. It has only about 3,000 people on it, and we have exactly 2 ferries a day during the week and fewer on the weekends. It took me 4 flights to get here, so I'm so happy to be here, and I thank the organizers for bringing me all this very long way to another coast and another island. So I'm going to talk to you today about equity, and I'm going to do so hopefully through a research lens, but also through an historical lens to take you through a kind of overview of the impacts of patriarchy on all of our lives. So to start, I like this little one. What's the difference between equity and equality? There is a difference. Equality simply means equal numbers. It's that equal sign. Equity actually means something very different. And equity, it turns out, is something that even monkeys and other animals comprehend. And yet, it's something that we humans are so bad at in practice. So some of you might know this. In an experiment a few years ago, researchers traded monkeys in view of each other a cucumber for a pebble. So the monkey gave the researcher a pebble and the researcher gave the monkey a cucumber. And then in view of each other, the researcher decided to give one monkey a grape for the pebble. Now, who knew monkeys really love grapes? Grapes are a big economy when it comes to monkey treats. And what did the other monkeys do when they saw this unjust practice? They actually refused to take the cucumber, or they chucked the cucumber at the researcher. Like, this is completely unfair, don't do this. So equity is being both fair and impartial. An understanding of equity is like understanding the difference between making everything equal and making things fair. And this is a hard concept. As a 12-year-old once put it to me, if we just try hard, and this was 20 years ago, and give girls the opportunities boys have, we can get computer science to 50 and 50. But equity means we need to, just like the monkeys understand intuitively, everyone to be allocated grapes and other resources fairly so that they can choose what they want to do and what they want to be, or they can choose the grapes. So thinking about coming from a wee island off the coast of Vancouver to this island off the coast of Sweden and thinking about video games, new developers, students, and having just taught a course on games, learning and literacies in which I asked a group of 14 out of 15 of whom had never touched any game making tool to make a digital game. I was thinking about how what we make, what stories we tell with games matters. And it matters from the standpoint of trying to live and make and have better lives, especially as we are so very much in this day and age, as the opening speaker put it yesterday, very much in a crisis around mental and even physical health. So almost 20 years ago, at a time when my colleagues and even the students who found themselves in my games class were incredibly skeptical about the power and potential of games, I had a woman who was in her early 60s who was a grandmother. And she was there because her son and granddaughter had recently moved in with her. She had been a nurse in a prior life, and she was teaching at a private girls' school, had retrained as a teacher. And the reason that she was there is because her son and her granddaughter were playing games all the time. She was doing a master's degree. She ended up in a group that were really ambitious, and they modded Neverwinter Nights to Shakespeare's Hamlet, did a little thing, it was lovely. So when demoing the game, and these are her words, but she said she went from an Xbox virgin to an Xbox whore. The point is, she never tried playing. She never even thought games were for her. And here I am all these years later, still introducing games to mostly teachers, but also girls who do not play them, but who, in playing, increasingly find that they enjoy not only the medium, but they see the power of the medium. So what had that grandmother understood 2 decades ago? Or what had my latest class of 14 students from different nations, ethnicities, and linguistic backgrounds come to understand? That access to video games, especially games that interest them or that they have a reason to be interested in, can be approached in much the same way we do other inequities, providing opportunities for people and not the usual suspects to play and make and think about video games. So I'm going to take you through some things you probably know already, maybe some things you don't know, through an historical approach to thinking about equity in thinking, design, and action through video games. And this is just a little order of play. Okay, so yesterday we heard from Kate, and I want to just be clear that the games industry is part of the technology sector, and it's a sector that has notoriously been inhospitable to women and for a lot longer than the video game industry. Even at best guess, women make up just about 30% of that sector. And of those who enter, 58% do not stay. That's some very interesting attrition. Even women trained to go into the industry mostly do not end up working in it. And it's so bad, as Jessica documented yesterday, and this just recently happened at Microsoft, a 90-page plus email on the harassment of women by men. So what I want to tell is a cautionary tale, and I want to remind you that this is not new. And I think it's important because, yes, 2018 was a shitty year in the video games industry, but so was 2012, and so were many other years, especially if you live or lived in one of the small communities that very much benefited from a small to medium-sized company, and especially if you lived in the 80s. Long before many of you were in the video game program here, and even before some of you were assistant profs, there was a video game industry continuously inhospitable to women. This is just some recent stuff that you all know. This is stuff you might not know as well. This happened in 2012, and it was a lot of stuff that got a lot of press. A writer for BioWare Harassed, and a series of blogs that were really trying to document the harassment that women faced when playing online games. And Not in the Kitchen Anymore was one of them, and I'll show you another one in just a minute. So the important thing here, I think, is that the video game industry, much like the tech industry, has had its own real trouble. This is before many of you got here. A hashtag that trended on Twitter, the #1 reason why there aren't more women in the game industry. And this is, I hear these and see these stories over and over again, and remember, this is 2012. In 2013, GDC took this on, and they said, okay, we better deal with this. They got a really amazing slate of women designers, and they continued that from 2013 to 2019. But it's still a conversation that we continue to have, and that we continue to have, and it's not just about women in the games industry, it's also about racialized others and all kinds of folks that don't fit the usual suspects, the usual mode. So this is I showed the attrition in the tech sector. This is a recent report by the Higher Education Video Game Alliance from 2019. And it shows, it's a really good report actually. It's very North American focused. They had 385 or so respondents to the survey. And what they show here is that men and women coming out of game design programs, when they're asked, is this their top choice? A lot of them say yes right away, and then that drops off. For men, it drops off to 60%, and for women, it drops, or 64%, and for women, it drops off to 40%, with just 40% of women saying that they will seek a job in the industry after 5 years. So part of this, as we all know, is also because of game culture and the kinds of masculinities that are always already fully on display. And it continues to be the case that the default presumption of video game players is male. And you want to know how I know? Because I ask kids all the time. Just was recently in a grade 2 class in Ontario in March and asked them who plays video games. All the boys put up their hands. A couple of girls did, and then I said, how many of you think that video games are for you? All the boys put up their hands. 2 girls did. So it continues to be the case that they don't see themselves as part of this culture. This is My Little Pony. Now I know there's a whole subculture under My Little Pony, but when you're designing for girls and women, this is a lot of time what you end up designing for. This was the Imagine series from Ubisoft that was horrific. But again, what's important is these are the kinds of games that when parents buy games for their female children, they buy these kinds of games. They buy games, they go look online and they buy some of these games, including Disneyland adventures. And then just as a way of kind of wrapping up this end, as we all know, and just for a reminder if we need one, video game advertising is no better. I'm just going to remind you of this. Yeah. So long before Gamergate was a blog called Fat, Ugly, or Slutty. It's still up and running, and it documented again the online hate that women were receiving when playing, especially in Xbox Live. Now, without spending too much time on this, but to flag it explicitly, I want to detail the conditions in the next little bit that women face as marginal subjects and sexualized objects in creative and cultural projects that the world's largest entertainment industry, as we heard yesterday, produces. And these examples, the ones that I just showed you, demonstrate a form of extreme gender norm enforcement that has at its very root a long history. And some of you might know this history, and some of you might not know. So I want to show you the history a little bit, tiny flyby, of this. So this is Catherine Schweitzer. She entered the Boston Marathon in 1967 under the initial K. And this is a photo of men trying to rip off her jersey. Why are they doing that? Because women weren't allowed to run in the Boston Marathon in 1967. Mary Beard. She's a classics professor at the University of Cambridge. She has a very public online persona. She tweets a whole hell of a lot. And she was looking at misogyny today and then in the past because she's a classics professor. And she has a lovely talk that's online called "Oh, Do Shut Up, Dear," in which she explains that very near the beginning of the tradition of Western literature, we find the first recorded examples of women telling a woman to shut up, that her voice was not to be heard in public, that only men had the right of public speech. Does this sound familiar? And those who dared to violate this speech right would be silenced by rape, by murder, by having her tongue cut out. And this should echo what Jessica was saying yesterday. She focuses first on a moment immortalized at the start of the Odyssey, in which the young Telemachus disciplines his mother Penelope, who dares to speak in public. "Mother," he says, "go back into your quarters and take up your own work, the loom and the distaff. Go make me a sandwich, Speech will be the business of men, and most of all, and me most of all, for mine is the power in this household. In fact, as Mary Beard puts it, quote, the more I've looked at the details of the threats and the insults that women are on the receiving end of, the more some of them seem to fit in the old patterns of prejudice and assumption. It doesn't matter what line of argument you take as a woman. If you venture into traditional male territory, the abuse comes anyway. It's not what you say that prompts it, it's the fact that you are saying it. So this is really important to understand because this is, I want to take this discussion outside of just video games and the video games industry being bad. No, patriarchy is the big common denominator here, and it's structuring all of our lives and our everyday lives. How do we know that? Because we get examples like this. Astronaut suits not fitting because there weren't two medium suits and they didn't expect that women would be in space together. Or this really recent article about mostly male animals being used in medical science research. So I want to be clear that it's not just game design. This is a tremendous challenge of just thinking and designing equitably, and it's in many other places and spaces. And, you know, we get it here too. In doing this with my own projects and in my own gaming making projects, and even as much as I try to practice what I preach, sometimes things don't get done as well as they might, and you know, you get a doctor that looks like this, which really didn't represent an idea. It took 2 months to get here, and it took another 2 months to get here to an indigenous mock-up. Now, thinking about also how to get from there to here, this is a lovely example of Larry Croft. I love it. It's done by a German designer who wanted to make a character that would appeal to gay men. And so it's actually shifted the gaze from the heterosexual male gaze. This is just some mock-ups that my students did just last week in the games course I taught, and they were really trying hard to represent folks differently. I noticed that I haven't played all the games yet, but I noticed that a lot of your games students were actually avoiding representation altogether, which I also think is a great way to go. But we also need more of this, even if it's not necessarily having one black playable character worth winning the big prize at GDC. It's so important that we have more of this, and so much more that we don't have to spend times on the games that do have it. So when you think about playing and wanting to play, I just want to point out that I've heard so many times game design teams choosing designs that make their games more accessible by the way of platforms being used. And that is very much the point, I think, of the last few years. Designing so that people can play, not just bound to game rigs at home or on consoles. They can play on their commutes, at doctor's office, waiting to pick up sproglets or puppies or cats or sloths. In fact, we've done over 100 interviews now with what people call casual game players, mostly people playing on their phones at bus stops, in the subway, on buses. And what we were finding out is fascinating. Finding out many of them don't actually pay anything. Some of them who do pay are paying because their spouses or significant others buy expensive games once to twice a month, and so they're actually spending that money on their casual games to equal things out. And we're also finding out from a very different demographic how they come to play these games. A lot of them are given the games by significant others, or they're told to play the games from their social networks or from younger people at work. So it's been a very fascinating study to date. Equity in the context of game making, to wrap up this part, I think is about 3 things. Making games that all skill sets can access and play. We don't have to do it all the time, but we need to think about it. choosing characters and worlds that are just, equitable, and maybe not always about humans. And I've seen a lot of that here. And also third, remembering that representation does matter. We want to recognize ourselves not in all games, because that would be silly, but in many more than we get to right now, especially if we're not of the cis, white, skilled, abled, maybe muscly male ilk. So that's Hank. He has nothing to do with this. I just want to make sure you were awake. Before moving on to the large funded research project I'm going to talk about a bit more in depth, I also wanted to touch on work that predated that with girls and boys in a during school and after school video game club. That work is important because we were able to create more equitable conditions for girls to make and play games, and by extension then study the conditions that support that play and making in order to recreate it. So I've done this with over 500 girls and boys in over 10 different contexts and over many years. And I will tell you that as long as you give girls the time to level up together in all girl groups and make their own choices outside of the purview of boys, that they play very much like the boys. Why is this important? It's important because gender research on video games now and in the past continues to find out facts about gender. Silly things like girls only like to play cooperatively, girls don't like quick twitch kinds of video games. We hear this over and over. But what we were able to show is if you actually put girls in front of and put gaming controllers in their hands, that they play very much like the boys. And in these other research projects, what people are calling facts about gender are actually facts about novice players. And they're finding out that actually when you level people up, they play very much similarly. And this is really important. It's important because gender difference research has, over the past 30 years, really just proven to be gender similarity research. And so we really need to take a step back anytime we're trying to look at either biological or sociological differences between genders. It really does turn out to be that we're more alike than we are different. So, on to the research project. I'll say the F word. We started in 2011 with a funded project that had feminists in its title. And this project brought together a group of researchers who were committed to combating inequity in video game making and culture and in the industry. And the reason that we did this is because we kept hearing from over and over again people working in the industry, but also young folks who were up and coming researchers and academics who were really having a hard time getting traction and were in fact getting quite harassed. That work led to a multi-million-dollar funded project by the Canadian government called Refiguring Innovation in Games. This project has researchers from all over Canada, the UK, and the US. And our main question is really how to create research that intervenes in the status quo. So how can we change the conditions of game culture and the games industry to make it a more equitable place for girls and women who want to be a part of this? We had to figure out how we were going to do this. We have 4 thematic research areas that I'm going to talk a bit about. They all end up overlapping. Games industry writ large, games and culture, informal learning, and formal education, which is very much like the program that you're in. And I'm going to start with informal education. Informal education is education that falls outside of paying money to go to university and formal education programs in general. This is Dames Making Games in Toronto. Feminists in Games seed funded a little bit this organization, which has since become a not-profit organization. And the main thing that they are doing is supporting women and others to make games. At the same time that we did this, we also seed funded a project in Montreal called Pixels. It's another group that's doing fabulous work in their local communities to bring women and others together informally to make games. Their programs include game writing, and it also includes a 6-week program on game design. And then we've held many, many game jams, including jams in the UK, out of which we have not just anecdotally, but empirically followed women from those jams and from those informal programs into the games industry and into satellite industries. This is a really lovely example. This is just from one incubator from Pixels, a 6-week program in which they took a group of women and this is their reach. It was a fabulous success, and they continue because they have funding from Intel, and then they also have funding from other folks who donate to them. So the informal programs are important because they're alternative pathways into the industry for women and other minorities. And they're not the usual suspect kinds of pathways. They're pathways that you're not paying for and that are organized by nonprofit folks. Now, in terms of formal education, we have gathered data from universities, all the university and college game programs in Canada, also in the UK, and done a scrape of the biggest ones in the US. We've also surveyed post-secondary programs in the US and the UK and in Canada, and we have qualitative case studies of game programs, including researcher Sean Gugalis, who has, I think they have over 300 interviews now. So provisional analyses have identified key challenges to inclusivity in formal education, including the recruitment of women and other gender minorities, the lack of critical game literacy in game program curricula. So you might study game design, but you're not actually looking critically at games, and the domination of technology and business programs by male students in comparison to the less gender stratified art and design programs in which there are more women. So I showed you a bit of this earlier. This is a very lovely survey that just came out on graduates from game programs. It's totally North America focused, but what I wanted to highlight is they were able to show that if you had an internship out of these programs, you had a more direct pathway to working in the industry. Okay, stay with me. Games and culture. We have a researcher who produced an LGBTQ video game archive, which is getting worked on to be more searchable so that folks can do their theses and dissertations on out of the games that have been collected there. We also have folks studying Twitch, participatory cultures and competitive gaming, and investigations into how masculinity manifests in play. So a lot of empirical evidence is coming out of this stream, and I don't have time to talk about it all, only just to say that this one particular project led by Adrian Shaw had a really nice output in Berlin, an exhibit that was open for a good 3 months, almost 4 months, that highlighted LGBTQ video games and video game characters. In addition, we have researchers like T.L. Taylor and Nick Taylor who are doing international studies of esports cultures and collegiate and professional levels. They have also worked very hard with this organization to create inclusive policies and practices in esports, and they have an amazing selection of resources that are really worth taking a look at if you are running any esports events. They even set up a template for you to have an inclusivity policy. In addition, we have folks working particularly on the indie industries and looking at cultural intermediaries in the games industries. We have folks working in large and small game studios doing game studio ethnographies to trace the ways in which people are grappling with equity and inclusion in those spaces and places. That has resulted in a couple of really lovely papers that are worth taking a look at, including this on the cultural intermediation of indie games. Why is this important for you? Because if you're thinking about starting up your own studio, these people know a lot about how you fail and why you fail. And so we've got some good research that shows that. I just wanted to pick this up. This is from yesterday when Kate was talking. But we also have some nice research that's out there, and this is separate from the refig work, that talks about how the games industry has been organized or not over the last 3 decades. Again, research that helps you think about how you're going to place yourself within this context. And then we also have folks who are working on a toolkit in VR that they're going to port over to the game industry. This is important because they're working with the to try to create, given the number of game studios that we've talked to who would like an inclusivity kind of toolkit. Toolkit's not the right word. We haven't figured out what we're going to call it. But they would like something that they could take to their own organizations and redo it based on their needs. This includes stuff like, importantly, how to read CVs or resumes more equitably. It also includes how to create job ads that are more inclusive and that hail more and different folks. And then we've also created an extensive database documenting the reported conditions and experiences of women working in the industry in Canada and the US. And this is being used to discover significant patterns of gender discrimination and to cross-correlate data on women's routes into and career pathways within the industry. It's led by Suzanne de Castel, and this is important because we only looked at the public speech of women. And it's important because folks like Jessica are always being called on to talk about women in games. And we really did not want to necessarily keep asking them the same questions. And we wanted to instead say what they had said in public. So many of the folks that we looked at had spoken multiple times on this topic. And Brenda Romero calls this the female tax. She says, quote, "It's all about my gender, not about my work. So much of my work is actually me talking about my gender, which I'm not trying to promote. I don't give a shit that I'm a woman. I do deeply give a shit about my work." And I think that's a really good echo of what Jessica said yesterday, that she would like to talk about her work in terms of the amazing writing that she's done around games. So there's a little sunset as a way to signal I'm coming to the end. This is important. Difference drives innovation. Mattel was on its way out until it redid its Barbie line. They posted a profit this year for the first time in like 4 or 5 years. So there's enormous opportunity if and when we can think about and support and create diversity in video games and elsewhere in order to reach a bigger audience, as well as appeal to and grow a different fan base. Difference drives innovation, and we have really nice research now that shows that. We know that research shows that the more diverse the workforce is, the more likely it is to be economically successful. However, what is really important here is that men are more likely than women to view the current industry as diverse. And even more important from the standpoint of making change is that the more women men work with, the more likely they are to believe that their company's workforce should be more diverse. So the more opportunity that you have of creating that critical mass of diversity, the more often you are likely to also embrace that diversity. So to go back to the beginning, equity isn't just about making everyone the same. It's about treating them fairly and understanding that women deserve the same pay, the same opportunities, the same treatment, and the same status as men. Equity is also about recognizing your own biases, because we all have them, and just because we do doesn't mean we can't recognize them or can't change them. And a deep commitment to equity means greater mental and physical well-being. It is no accident that, as we have heard, and from all three speakers that preceded me, that health and well-being, including mental health, are ever more challenged today, regardless of whether or not you work in the video game industry. And that a big part of that, I think, is because of worldwide growing inequity. So takeaway points. Patriarchy is structural, and it places limits on women and others, and an orientation to equity counters that bias. Harassment's not going to go away. It's been here forever. So we have to find really effective ways of dealing with it and reporting it and trying to counteract it. Education is a barrier, but not the only one, and there are other routes and other ways into a games industry or any other job you want. Interventionist research can bridge the equity gap because it changes the condition of play and making for women and other minorities. And as I sort of showed you, tried to right at the end, an orientation to equity benefits everyone, not just women. And finally, diversity drives innovation, and it can be key to economic growth. Thank you.
So, question time. Any questions?
I don't bite.
No questions, apparently. You have a question? Yeah.
Awesome talk, thanks so much. I have one question. What measures would you recommend a game program to increase diversity and attract a more diverse student population to the program?
What measures? So there's a couple of things. Being careful about recruitment ads. Actually having a diverse faculty turns out to very much help recruit diverse students. Third thing is curriculum. Curriculum that is really it's not even that it's coding heavy, but the curriculum that already privileges stuff like sports or whatever else tends to very much sort of disadvantage women and others who are not interested in that. So curriculum's another big one. It's one where, at least in computer science, it's been there have been really successful programmatic changes when they've changed their curriculum, and it's one where of the two programs I can think of in Canada where they changed their curriculum, they started attracting different folks to their programs. And they didn't actually diversify their faculty that much, but once the curriculum changed, they started getting other applications that they didn't have before. So I think those two things go hand in hand. And then I think the fourth thing is we read applications of students who apply to our programs, and a lot of times, well, not a lot of times, but too often, I think we're always looking for what we know and not for difference. And so reading those applications is another way of, reading the applications more generously or differently is another way of doing it. I know some programs that have blinded the name of the applicant so that you don't know if they're a man or a woman.
Excellent.
So those are four things.
So I will
Thank you.
take note. Thank you.
So under the heading of not trying to make everyone the same,
Yeah.
I think any woman who's been in the industry for a while knows you get mentored.
Yeah.
But a lot of times that mentorship ends up trying to make you fit into the culture, which to me is a huge problem if you're trying to get more diverse people into your company or your program, to presumably have them change your program for the better, and then what happens is they end up having to, get sanded down to fit into the program. Right. How do you, with all of these equity programs that you're talking about, how do you make sure that there's that balance between teaching people pragmatically what they need to know to survive in the industry without trying to mentor out everything that makes them different?
Yeah, I think that's a super good question, and I guess what I would say is most of these programs actually are not mentorship programs, so that's first and foremost. they do have that component, but because they're so oriented to hailing difference, what they very much try to do is to, at least Pixels I know and DMG for sure, is they try to use that as a driver for making different kinds of games. And, you know, but these are little personal games, most of them. They're not going to go sell a lot of money. So that's one way. The second way is, and I know that mentorship has been a huge thing in the games industry for women, but also imported from the tech industry. It's not something that any of our projects are particularly focused on, and the reason is that it turns out that when you speak to women who have been mentored, that they don't actually find that a valuable resource in the same way that men do. So we have like decades of research of women saying, look, it's not going to help me to be mentored by so-and-so up there. Very much like what you said yesterday. It's my network here, my near peers, that make more of a difference to me than someone up here or over there. And I think that's in large part because, and we have good research on this too, from the business side of the world, because women do not mentor in the same way as men do. And we don't have those networks of bars and guy time and those kinds of things, and it's well documented. So I think it's a really hard tension, but it's certainly not part of the way in which I see going forward women are going to be successful in the industry. I don't think mentorship is going to do it. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
Hi. Thank you for the really interesting talk. I'm curious, do you believe that equity will eventually lead to equality within the game industry, or do you believe there will always be a disproportionate amount of number?
Oh, equity, it's not really a belief system. I mean, once you have equity in place, equality kind of comes along behind it. Mm-hmm. Do I think like that 12-year-old that eventually will get to 50 and 50 in the games industry? Maybe. We've certainly got there in medicine and law and many other places and spaces. The interesting thing that happens when that happens, though, is a lot of times we have basically the devaluation of jobs once there are more women in those jobs. So, for example, if you look at medicine, general practitioners in the US and Canada used to make a ton more money than they're making now. And why is that? Because there's more women doing those jobs. So I don't think that, I think equity is a way in. Do I think it's going to lead to equality? Sometimes it does. Other times it really doesn't. But at least it's a goal. And it's a goal that I think is worthy of thinking about a more just and sustainable world.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Any other questions? No. So
Thank you.
next talk starts at 10. See you then. Thank you.
Thank you.